Subhash Kak is an author and the Regents professor at Oklahoma State University. Subhash, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Glad to be on your show.
So to start, I want to talk to you about consciousness and AI today. And to start, could you just define what is consciousness?
Consciousness is, of course, something that everybody is talking about because there is the prospect of computers becoming conscious. So what does it really mean for a AI machine to be conscious? That's the question. Well, one way of looking at it is from the perspective of awareness. Conscious beings are those who are aware of themselves, while a computer is not aware of itself, at least not yet. Now, of course, that brings up the question, will computers of the future become aware, self aware? And should that happen, of course, everything will change because then they would be competing with us humans because we are certainly self aware. Now, of course, from a philosophical point of view, there are those that this idea of awareness itself might be misleading, and we may actually be like zombies. We think we are aware, but really, the sense of awareness comes to us after the event. Now, of course, one can argue around it one way or the other, and there's no proving it. But a couple of years ago, I proved a theorem where I showed that computers will never be conscious, which would suggest that our sense of awareness is indeed distinct from this philosophical disputation about, whether this sense comes to us after we have already, observed something. In the computer science community or AI community, there are many who believe that once more and more aspects of the brain are emulated by machines, and once the silicon machine becomes as complex as the brain, because the brain is extremely complex. The brain has neurons which equal the number of stars in the cosmos. It's huge, trillions upon trillions of neurons which are interconnected amongst themselves. While a computer is also complex, but it's not that complex. So there are the believers who believe that once computers also attain the same complexity as that of the brain, then suddenly something uh, will happen and a new phenomenon would emerge, which is the phenomenon of consciousness. In fact, a lot of psychologists or neuroscientists also subscribe to this view. But we can argue, or at least in the mathematical theorem that I proved, that this is not going to happen because certainly consciousness is a unity. You are conscious or you're not, right? You're asleep or you are awake. And when you are conscious, you cannot have parts of you who are also conscious. It's one. It's a unity. Now you can imagine a giant computer, which is so huge that parts of it have gone beyond that threshold, which, according to this theory, implies consciousness. Then you would have a situation where you have a big machine which is conscious and its subparts are also conscious, which is a contradiction, right? Therefore, this proves that computers will never be conscious. So this is the proof. In fact, it's much more technical, but this is the intuition behind the proof.
So how has our understanding of consciousness in society changed over time? Have we only recently come to this understanding, or have we had this understanding of consciousness for a long time?
Well, in academic circles, until about 30, 40 years ago, one was not supposed to talk about consciousness. You could talk about mind, and you could talk about the intellectual abilities of individuals, but not consciousness at all. Now, this has changed slowly in the latter part of the 20th century because the deepest science that there is quantum mechanics. And in quantum mechanics, the very act of observing a system changes the system. So there are a lot of philosophers of science and others who have been asking, well, how does that happen? Why does observation have an influence on materiality? Because the system is material. And therefore, people have said, well, maybe we need to determine whether we should be discussing what consciousness is. Now, if one were to step back, also in religious discourse for centuries, people have talked about the soul without saying what the soul is. And somehow it's been implicitly assumed that the soul is something inside one's body, right? But now in science, we are not supposed to talk about soul because you can't define it. But consciousness is something that one can define, right? Awareness is something that one can define. And therefore, with all this in the background, people have been talking about consciousness in academic subjects. There are many journals. In fact, the proof that I published, it was appeared in a journal called Journal of AI and Consciousness. And so there's a lot of stuff, and psychologists and neuroscientists as well are discussing it, as are physicists and computer scientists. Why? Because, as I mentioned, computer scientists, at least some of them, believe that at some point AI machines will become conscious, right? Although, as I argued, that's not going to happen. But now in psychology or in neuroscience, the question arises, where is this consciousness occurring inside the brain, right? Does it happen at a certain point? Is there a certain module which does it? And they've discovered that really when you are conscious, you can analyze the brain through what is called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and you can see which part of the brain is lighting up. And what they've discovered is that depending upon what you're doing, different parts of the brain light up. So there's no single point in the brain which lights up consistently lights up based on the fact that you're conscious. So perhaps consciousness is sort of diffuse. And the other way of looking at it is that maybe consciousness, if it's not a property of the brain, as I argue, then it's something which is what one might call transcendent, which is not material. It's not of matter and time, right? And therefore, it's present everywhere. And that has very fascinating implications for religion, for psychology, and certainly it has implications for our understanding of how creativity occurs. So creativity, if one were to follow this argument, does not happen just because you are trying out various combinations and permutations of certain ideas, in a formal system inside your brain. Because once you are within a system, you can't be creative. You can never transcend it. You can never go beyond it. But if consciousness is not material, if it's transcendent and it's present everywhere, then it can operate in counterintuitive ways, and that also opens the doorway to religion. Maybe the way we have looked at religion in a kind of a mechanical way here is each one of us has a soul, and then there is God who's going to be watching us, and then at some point, he will judge us or whatever. So in this scientific understanding, then consciousness is present everywhere, and we are also that consciousness, accepting that we look at the contents of our mind as our true self. But our true self is this light which illuminates the contents of the mind. It's just a shift in perspective. And if one were to be with that light, which illuminates the contents of the mind, and the mind is mechanical, mind is, of course, in the brain, then perhaps one would be able to find ways of becoming creative. Suddenly something could happen, or you could, if one were to say that normally in our mind, this light is obscured by different coverings of habit or coverings of emotion. If you can get rid of those coverings, suddenly you are one with the light, and suddenly you have extraordinary knowledge. And that's how at least the stories that we have of inventors and scientists and artists all across the world, what they uh, admit is that, look, I wasn't thinking consciously. I was dreaming. Suddenly an idea came to me. It didn't come to me from myself. Almost everybody, this is sort of universal, that creativity is outside of one's mind. And it's consistent with this new view of consciousness.
Hmm. Is there a gradient to consciousness, or is it a binary? There's either consciousness or not consciousness.
Well, one is either aware or not aware. Sometimes you can wake up and you're groggy and you may not even remember where you're waking up, right? And so your mind is not clear. So the gradation that exists is related to the clarity of your mind, because mind is an instrument. But consciousness by itself is either present or not present. It's off or on. Uh, However, our experience within our mind would have a gradation. And that's why, there's some people who act bizarrely because maybe they don't have that clarity, right? Or a lot of people live in their module, in their bubble of belief system. And in that belief system, which is like a covering on this light within you, within that bubble, then they see things which to somebody who's not in a bubble would appear absolutely outlandish. One might say, hey, what's wrong with this person? Why doesn't he or she see things as they are? And that can happen. But as I explained, that's because of the covering on the light.
Hmm. Well, so in the context of artificial intelligence, is there something you say it's not possible for computers to become conscious, but is there anything else that society should be thinking about that might be close to consciousness or akin to consciousness in the context of artificial intelligence?
See, what's interesting is that most of what we humans do can be replicated by machines. Most of what we do is procedural, and whatever is procedural can be replicated. So, literally, everything excepting when we are creative, we are replaceable. So it's both good, a good sign that computers will not be conscious, but at the same time doesn't alter the picture at all. We will be replaced, and since we'll be replaced, and even you and I and everybody else, if we can have a agent who does something for us, we'll let that agent do that job for us, and society will do that. And when people realize that there are very few jobs for the next generation, they'll have fewer babies, as is already happening. As we know, population is collapsing in most parts of the world right now. And that will only be accelerated. But then at the same time, from a societal perspective, it also gives us the insight really we are really the same individual, because all of us have the same consciousness. It's transcendent, but you and I, if we are different, it's only because of our different life history, right? Our the history which is coded in our mind and which becomes a lens. So we are looking at events through that lens. But in reality, our the true being within us is the same. And so it's also a matter of hope that if that is the case, maybe we can look at life somewhat differently and find, first of all, meaning within ourselves, and find also that magic which exists within each one of us. Because if you're not just machines, there are two ways of looking. We are machines like computers, right? Which is the old idea. We are machines like computers with something like the soul who is responsible. The other is we are not machines like a computer. There is something absolutely extraordinary about us, and that is that light of consciousness. And maybe that light of consciousness can guide us to deep experience, which really makes life worth living. Because if there's no that deep experience, then maybe people can get depressed, or they can get addicted to one thing or the other, because they find something missing in their life.
So is consciousness something that we can advance as a society? Can we advance either our understanding of or our practice of consciousness?
Well, just as there is personal consciousness, each one of us is conscious in a certain way, there's also collective consciousness. So, and that's where your question comes in, as a society. So, if more and more people believed that indeed, um, uh, collectively we can go in a direction where we empower every individual to discover themselves, to discover that magic in themselves. That'll be wonderful, right? Because if, on the other hand, we were to believe that we are basically all fragmented. If we are fragmented, then the question of domination comes in. Then we must go to war. Then we must reduce those who oppose us, right? So these are two different ways. So why do wars occur? Domination. And certainly in society, that's also an angle, because we are also body. It's not to say that we are only that light which illuminates the contents of our mind. We are also body. So we'll always have war. We'll also have struggle. We'll also have this desire to dominate. But how do we complement? How do we take these two complementary aspects to our existence and come up with a path which is good? Where everybody can move forward and discover their potential.
Yeah. Well, on that note, what do you think the future of consciousness looks like, or our understanding of consciousness? Do you see any developments on the horizon, or any advances in that collective consciousness that you described?
Well, I think a fundamental revolutionary change in society, because as we mentioned before, population has begun to fall, and that process is going to only accelerate. And there is this Wittgenstein Institute of Demography in Vienna, which argues that the population of the Earth in 2300 will be only 100 million. So that is about 1/80th of what it is now. So clearly, going there from where we are now will create a lot of challenges and also opportunities. So if we are much fewer on globe, first of all these questions of man destroying climate or damaging climate, etc., will not be central, because if we are fewer, then no matter what we do, we won't be putting that much of carbon, if carbon is indeed a very important factor that we have to consider as far as climate is concerned. So that won't be an issue. So the whole politics itself will change, right? And then it will also have an impact on society, on family. If there are very, very few children, clearly the way we look at each personal life will change. A couple of generations ago, everybody was focused on family. That's not the case. A lot of young people are not necessarily looking to have children, or at most have one children. So even if you have one child, that child's life is going to be much more lonely than if that child was one out of many, right? 100 years ago, there used to be 5, 6, 10 children in a family. That's not the case anymore. It's one or two or none. So many implications of this all, and it cannot be. I think some people argue that maybe things will change, and we can give incentives to every family. The government can give incentives that have more children, etc. But that's not happening. That's not happening in countries like South Korea. Right now, the fastest fall in population is in South Korea. 100 people make only 30 babies, 34 babies right now. And in 5 generations, the population will be 1/10 of what it is now. In 10 generations, it'll be 100th, which is precisely what the Wittgenstein Institute of Demography. In 10 generations, the population will fall to 1/80th of what it is now, because of what is happening in countries like South Korea or all of Europe. If you had a fertility rate of 1.3 rather than 2.1, which is what the case right now is in Europe and North America, then in 10 generations, population falls to 100th of what it is right now.
Wow.
And one generation is 30 years. 10 generations, about 300 years.
Yeah. Well, so you've talked about this before, but what do you think the role of artificial intelligence will be in that transition in the future, as more and more countries have populations that are declining?
Well, AI will make the tedium of life go away. Literally what we do. Right now, we still have to drive. When one's young, driving is fun, but once one's older, you don't find it as as enjoyable, and or in big traffic. So okay, when computers are driving everything, or AI machines, AI transportation, well, first of all, 60-70% of jobs in any advanced country are about transportation. Those jobs go away. But it also reduces the tedium of driving. And certainly, machines will do an increasing role in agriculture. They already do tremendous role in agriculture. In fact, in the US, which is a great agriculture country, the population which lives in the rural areas is only about 2 or 3%. So they will be, and literally as new LLM based AI programs applications have shown, um, you can create poetry, you can do art, you can have a conversation with an agent, right? You can do literally all, and it's very hard now to discover whether the person that you're talking to on the machine is a real machine, or whether it's deep fake, right? So there'll be more of that, and all of that will on the one hand leave many people lost. Hey, what's going on in our world? But on the other hand, they'll also learn to navigate through it, and then they say, let's take advantage of it, and let's really go to the heart of the problem, or heart of what life is. What does it mean to be alive? So I think both a challenge and a potential, and AI uh, would be an instrument which everybody would use, because AI will become even more and more powerful. But as I said, literally all that we do in our lives also is something where AI can replace us.
Hmm.
Literally everything. But that's the way it is.
Yeah. Well, Subhash, thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Joe.